Hello, welcome back. We are going to be in Hebrews chapter 10 today. We're going to look at the first half of this chapter. My name is Nathan House, and I am with the Houston Church of Christ in Houston, California. So again, feel free to contact me if you'd like, and I would ask you to like and to subscribe to this video if you could. So let's go ahead and get into the text here. So in chapter 10 of the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer begins, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come." Now, we've talked about this in a previous video, the idea that there are some things that are a shadow of the real things. Back in chapter 8, verse 5, the Hebrew writer uses this phrase again. If you go back to chapter 8, just real quickly, look at this phrase. You'll see it again. It says here, talking about the priests on earth, verse 4, "Now if he were on earth," talking about Jesus Christ, "he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law." Watch this. Those priests who offer gifts according to the law, the Hebrew writer says, they serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. So the things that the Old Testament priests were doing were a shadow of the real things being in heaven where Jesus Christ serves. And so again, back to chapter 10, verse 1, the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. Those things in the Old Testament, they are a shadow of the real things. The Old Testament priests were a shadow of the true priests. The Old Testament tabernacle was a shadow of the true dwelling place of God. So in the Old Testament, they were serving a shadow of the good things to come. And as such, these things can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered. And again, notice this phrase, they are continually offered. Those Old Testament sacrifices were offered every single year. The Day of Atonement was offered every year. The high priest went in every year to offer sacrifices. And of course, there was ongoing sacrifices as well. But they were offered every year, that day on the Day of Atonement. And then look at what the Hebrew writer says. "But they could never make perfect those who draw near." Well, why couldn't they? Because they couldn't deal with sin. Because those Old Testament sacrifices that were a shadow of the true sacrifice, they couldn't deal with the problem of sin. And again, this goes back to chapter 8. This goes back to earlier in the book of Hebrews, where the Hebrews writer talks about there would be a new covenant that would deal with sin. But in the old law, the old covenant, there was simply a reminder of sin. He continues in verse 2, "Otherwise, these sacrifices have to continue, right? Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? If they could make perfect those who were drawing near to worship, they wouldn't have to continually offer these sacrifices, since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin. But in these sacrifices, these Old Testament sacrifices, these were a reminder of sins every year." See, there's people nowadays who are trying to, and again, this is an ancient problem. There's people who are trying to blend Christianity and Judaism. Even today, this is still happening. There is a movement among some who call themselves Christians to take from the Old Testament and try to bind that on New Testament believers. But it was not sufficient then. It's not sufficient now. Their sacrifices did not deal with the problem of sin. They simply reminded those who were coming to worship God, those who were journeying to Jerusalem. There was a reminder every year. I'm walking to Jerusalem to offer these sacrifices. Every year there was a reminder that I still have these sins. Well, why is that the case? Verse 4 is the conclusion of this. This is why. Because it's impossible for those animal sacrifices to take away sins. You see, this is highlighting the weaknesses of the law, the weaknesses of the sacrifices that would be offered according to the old law. But then in verses 5 through 18, he begins to show you something better. And again, this is kind of the whole heart of the book of Hebrews, right? That something better has come in the person of Jesus Christ, in the work of Jesus Christ. So now here he begins to unpack this idea of something better. Because of this inadequacy of the law, something better had to be offered. Verse 5, "Consequently, when Christ came into the world," so now he's going to, like we've seen in the book of Hebrews, he introduces an Old Testament passage, and then he discusses that. He comments on this Old Testament passage. So here he's introducing for the reader Psalm chapter 40, verse 6 through 8. And again, I would encourage you to go back and read that on your own. But here he introduces it again. "So when Christ came into the world, he said," so this is again speaking as if it's Christ, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, talking about the Father. These you haven't desired. Well, why not? Because they couldn't deal with the problem. Instead, look at what Jesus Christ continues to say, but a body you have prepared for me. Go, in John chapter 1, verse 14, right? Jesus Christ, the incarnation, he came in the flesh. This is talking about this. You prepared a body for me. Why did God prepare a body for Christ? Because there had to be a better sacrifice. It wasn't in burnt offerings and sin offerings. God didn't take pleasure in them. That's not what he desired. Verse 7 says, then I said, again, Christ is speaking, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as is written of me in the scroll of the book. Jesus Christ came to do the will of God. What was that? It required him to take a body. So then he's now going to comment on this Psalm chapter 40, verses 6 through 8 passage. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings. These were offered according to the law. Then he added, I have come to do your will. The Hebrew writer then comments, he does away with the first. The first what? The first law with its sacrifices that were inadequate. He does away with the first. Why? To establish the second. Look at verse 10. And by that will, what will is he talking about? The will of God. By the will of God, it was God's will for Jesus to take a body. And by that will, verse 10, we have been sanctified. This is a perfect passive participle. It's kind of interesting to think about this for a second. What does that mean? Well, it's perfect, meaning the sacrifice was offered in the past, but its actions continue in the future. Its impact continues in the future. The impact of that sacrifice wasn't just one moment in time. It was a once-for-all event. The sacrifice that happened in the past, its impact, its reach continues even after the event is completed. So it's perfect, meaning it continues. It's passive, meaning I'm not sanctifying myself. I can't do that. I'm not holy. I can't make myself, I can't remove my own sins. Somebody else, something else had to sanctify me, had to cleanse me, had to make me holy. What was it that sanctified me, that cleansed me? It was the sacrifice of this body. It was a sacrifice of that body. And by that, and this was God's will, right? And by that will, we have been sanctified. How? Through the offering of the body. The body that God prepared for him. The body that was the will of God. And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. Now watch this, once for all. That goes back to that idea that this is a perfect passive participle. Perfect meaning it was happened in the past, right? But it's a once for all event. And this idea, this phrase, once for all, it is a reoccurring idea. If you go back and you look at chapter 9, verse 26, right? It says, but as it is, he has appeared once for all to put away sin by the sacrificing of himself. We see it in verse 27, as it is appointed for man to die once. So this once for all idea. Verse 28, so Christ having been offered once to bear the sins of many. You come down in verse 2 of here. Otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshiper, having once been cleansed, would no longer have. See, the problem is those sacrifices, they weren't a one-time event. They were a yearly event. But the body of Jesus Christ was a once-for-all event. A once-for-all time. Verse 11, and every priest, this is again talking about the Old Testament sacrifices, the Old Testament law, the Old Testament covenant. Every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly. And again, this idea of repeatedly is contrasted with the idea of once for all. They have to do this repeatedly, right? In these sacrifices that were constantly be reminded, there was a reminder of sins. They were continually offered. Verse 1. Every priest did this repeatedly. And then the Hebrew writer again makes this concluding statement, which goes back to verse 4. Look at what he says. They offer this repeatedly, and they can never take away sins. But when Christ has offered for all time, and again, this is that idea of once for all, right? Here it is in verse 10. Here is a phrase in verse 11. He did this once for all. He did it at a single sacrifice for sins. Not doing it repeatedly as the high priest did in the Old Testament. He did this with a single sacrifice. Then afterwards, he sat down at the right hand of God. This phrase, the right hand of God, goes back to earlier in the book of Hebrews, when the Hebrew writer was talking about Psalm chapter 110, verse 4, right? He made this sacrifice one time for all mankind, one time to deal with sin. And after doing so, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting for that time until his enemy should be made a footstool. For by a single offering, and again, notice this contrasting idea, a single offering for all time. And that's contrasted with this repeated sacrifice, which could not take away sin, which was being done every year. For by a single offering, he, Jesus Christ, has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And again, just like we saw this a moment ago, perfect passive participle. And the Holy Spirit bears witness to us. See, we needed a better covenant. A covenant that could deal with sin. A covenant that didn't just simply remind us of sin, but a covenant that removed sin, that cleansed the conscience. And so this goes back to earlier in Hebrews chapter 8, where the Hebrews writer introduced Jeremiah 31. And so this again is a portion of Jeremiah 31. Go back and look at that Hebrews chapter 8 passage. The Holy Spirit bears witness. So the Holy Spirit, again, the Hebrew writer ties the Holy Spirit to the work of the book of Jeremiah. And again, that's important and interesting just as we consider how the Bible came to be. But he says the Holy Spirit bared witness to us, for after saying, this is the covenant. I'm making a new covenant I will make with them after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws on their hearts, write them on their minds. And then he skips to the end of Jeremiah 31, verse 34, and he says, I will remember their sins no more. You see, those other sacrifices were a reminder of sins. But the once and for all sacrifice of Jesus Christ was the new covenant, was the better covenant, was the covenant that cleansed the conscience of those followers of Christ, was the sacrifice that cleansed the conscience, that removed the reminder. And then the Hebrew writer just makes this concluding remark: where there is forgiveness, there's no longer any offering for sin, because Jesus Christ's sacrifice was better. It was sufficient. It cleansed for all time, once for all, those who accepted that sacrifice, those who received Jesus Christ. This is a better sacrifice. This is a better covenant. This is a better promise. I'm going to quickly put on the screen a recap of what we just have talked about. So real quickly, chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. I'm going to take myself off for a minute. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 4 highlights the weakness of the law and its sacrifice. It was a shadow. It can never make perfect those who draw near or draw near. It couldn't cleanse their conscience. In fact, it was simply a reminder of sins. Why? Because animal sacrifices couldn't deal with the problem of sin. This is contrasted with the better sacrifice, something better. Because the law was a shadow, not the true form, it couldn't deal with sin. Therefore, God had a better covenant in mind. Chapter 8, chapter 10. God's will was for Christ to come into the world and offer himself as a better sacrifice. This sacrifice was shouldn't be once for Al, although if your name is Al, it was for you as well. But the sacrifice was once for all time. The sacrifice did away with that first law, with that first covenant. This something better, this better sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It was God's will for him to have that body sanctified for all time, those who were drawing near to God. You see, we have something better in Jesus Christ. That is something that we should hold on to. That is something that we should have hope in and be encouraged by. Whatever this world throws at us, we have something better. Let's hold on to that better sacrifice, to that better covenant, that which we have in Jesus Christ. You guys have a great day. God bless.